Imagine this. The UK government sets a course aiming to tackle these really ballooning welfare costs. But then, well, the ship hits some pretty rough political seas, forcing a major course correction. That's what we're digging into today. We're looking at the latest UK welfare reforms and, crucially, what they signal for Scotland. Our goal to get past the headlines, understand the actual changes, and see how two governments are now sailing in quite different directions on Social Security. What does it mean for people? And maybe just as important, what does it mean for the budgets?
Yeah, and we're drawing on recent news, political analysis, mainly that BBC piece, What Do UK Welfare Reforms Mean for Scotland? It really lays out a fascinating, evolving situation.
It really does. The sources show these sudden changes, lots of political maneuvering. So the UK government's initial aim seemed clear enough, right? Get a grip on these benefit costs.
Right.
But was that ever really realistic given everything?
That's a key question because what's interesting isn't just, the U-turn itself, it's how it happened. The pressure from within Parliament, those substantial concessions made to their own backbenchers, that directly reshaped the policy.
Right.
The original idea was straightforward. Deal with a predicted 30 billion rise in health benefits for working age people, try and get more people working, but it turned into this, well, high stakes political game.
Substantial concessions. That sounds pretty significant.
Yeah.
What did that actually mean for their plan? Did it sort of gut the original reform idea?
Well, it certainly changed the immediate effect. Big time. The plan changes to PIP, personal independence payments. They now only affect new claimants.
Only new ones.
Yeah, and even then, they're delayed, pushed back until after they review the criteria. So if you're already getting PIP, nothing changes, for now at least. It really shows how political leverage, in the real world can just force a change in direction, even on major plans.
Okay, so PIP changes are kicked down the road, only for new people. But universal credit, that's UK wide still.
That's right. Universal credit applies everywhere. And yes, new claimants for the health part might face tougher assessments.
Okay.
And this is the twist, the standard part of universal credit, the basic payment, that's actually set to go up
Up more than inflation.
for the next 4 years. Yeah, above inflation. So, despite wanting to cut spending, this specific reform, it's actually going to cost the government money initially.
Wow. Okay, that is not what you'd expect. Is that just like a political calculation they had to make?
It seems like a real paradox, isn't it? It led to what the sources called one of Sir Keir Starmer's most difficult days, shows how fast things can shift when the pressure's on. It looks like a strategic retreat, basically, forced by politics.
Right. But while all that's happening in Westminster, Scotland, it's a different story altogether, isn't it? They have their own devolved system.
Completely different. They're phasing out PIP and bringing in their own thing, the Adult Disability Payment, or ADP.
ADP. Yeah.
And that's moving fast. They reckon 99% of PIP cases are already on ADP now. The rest should be done by year end.
And the key thing here is what the Scottish government is saying.
Exactly. They've been crystal clear. No cuts to ADP. Shirley-Ann Somerville, the social justice secretary, basically said, we're not following Labor on this.
Not following Labor's lead. That's pretty blunt.
It is. It signals, two governments, same island, but moving in totally different directions on welfare.
So what does that mean, having Scotland go its own way like this?
Well, it creates this real divergence. How people experience the welfare system depends on where they live in the UK. And the scale in Scotland is significant. You're talking over 475,000 people on these benefits. That's what, about 1 in 10 adults?
1 in 10, wow.
And that number shot up 50% higher in less than 3 years, and over half of them are over 55. So it's a big cohort.
And this difference, it's not just ADP, is it? Scotland talks a lot about being, quote, more generous.
Yeah, they point to other things too, like the Scottish child payment that's £27.15 a week. The government's own figures suggest it could keep 40,000 kids out of relative poverty this year. Plus, they uprate benefits with inflation each year. They've brought in a new winter fuel payment. It's all part of this distinct philosophy they're building.
But generosity, well, it costs money.
Yeah.
And the numbers you mentioned earlier sound pretty large.
They are. The Scottish Fiscal Commission, they're the independent forecasters, say Social Security was 6.1 billion of Scotland's budget for 2024-25.
6.1 billion.
And it's forecast to jump to 7.7 billion next year, and potentially over 9 billion by, say, 2029-30.
That's a steep climb.
It is. And linking back to ADP, that's the biggest piece by far, projected to hit 5 billion itself by the end of the decade.
5 billion just for ADP.
Yep. Compare that. It's nearly 10 times the cost of the Scottish child payment, and maybe 30 times the devolved winter fuel payment. It really shows that gap, doesn't it, between what's politically prominent, what gets talked about, and what actually carries the most financial weight.
That really is the elephant in the room, then, isn't it?
Mhm.
Funding all this. Scotland's spending on Social Security is already 1.2 billion more than the money it gets from Westminster for the block grant.
That's right.
And that gap's predicted to grow to £2 billion by 2029-30. How? How do they manage that? Where does that extra £2 billion come from?
That's the huge question for the Scottish Parliament, Holyrood. And think back to the UK situation. If Westminster does eventually manage to cut its welfare bill, despite the recent U turn,
Right.
that actually reduces the funding flowing north through the block grant,
Ah.
which makes Scotland's gap even wider. It's interconnected.
So they're facing this growing gap. What levers can they actually pull? What are they doing?
Well, they have used their income tax powers a bit to raise extra cash.
Okay.
But the finance secretary, Shona Robeson, she's basically said, we can't keep doing that. Ruled out more tax rises for the rest of this parliament. Can't keep going back to the well.
So no more tax rises. What else?
They're talking about public service reform, trying to trim the size of the public sector workforce, cut government running costs, standard efficiency drives, really. And interestingly, there's been a bit of a shift away from just purely universal benefits, too.
Ah, like the winter fuel payment, that example.
Exactly. Initially, they wanted it for everyone, but now they're actually copying the UK model, targeting it more, clawing back payments from people who are better off. So, a bit of pragmatism creeping in, perhaps.
Seems like it.
Yeah, and even something like John Swinney's promise to offset the UK's two-child benefit cap.
Yeah.
Politically, that's huge for them,
Right.
but financially, it's estimated around 200 million a year by 2030. Significant, yes, but still just a fraction of the cost of ADP. It really highlights that political impact versus financial weight difference again.
Okay, so you've got these tight budgets, these different approaches, sets up a really interesting political battleground for the Holyrood election next year. How are the main parties, SNP and Labour, positioning themselves?
Well, it's fascinating because they're often chasing the same voters, but their pitches are quite different, the SNP. They're leaning heavily on their record, big state interventions, universal entitlements. Their leaflets are full of it. Scottish child payment, free tuition, free prescriptions, free bus travel for young people, free school meals. The list goes on. Baby boxes, childcare.
Right, the whole package.
The message is pretty clear. Vote for us, we'll be more generous. It's a bet that voters value that social safety net, even if the finances look tricky.
Okay, that's the SNP pitch. What about Scottish Labour under Anna Sarwar?
His message is different. He's explicitly not promising a kind of traditional tax and spend approach for Holyrood.
Oh, so what's the focus?
It's more about growing the economy. The idea is that growth will sustain public services and maybe, just maybe, allow for tax cuts down the line.
So growth first, then services.
Yeah.
Well, the SNP is more services first, find the money later.
That seems to be the broad difference in emphasis. Yeah, he's trying to walk that line, promising good public services, but without big tax hikes.
It sounds like both parties are grappling with the same core issues, though. Tight money, not much economic growth, costs going up.
Absolutely. They face very similar problems. The difference lies in the solutions they're offering, and crucially, who voters trust more to actually deliver come next May.
So wrapping this up then, what does it all mean for you listening? We've got the UK government trying, maybe struggling, to control welfare spending, making concessions along the way. And then you have Scotland forging its own path, committed to being more generous, but facing this ballooning social security bill, mostly driven by ADP.
It leaves you with a big question, doesn't it? Given the UK's difficulties in actually reducing welfare spending, even when they try, and Scotland's budget pressures growing because of things like ADP, how sustainable is this divergence? How might these clashing priorities reshape the whole relationship between the UK and Scottish governments? And what happens, when the money really does get tight and both sides seem to have limited options left on tax and spending? Definitely something to mull over.